The 60s were the age of youth, as 70 million children from the post-war baby boom became teenagers and young adults. The movement away from the conservative 50s continued and eventually resulted in revolutionary ways of thinking and real change in the cultural fabric of American life. No longer content to be images of the generation ahead of them, young people wanted change. The 60s began as white, middle class, and conservative in the extreme. It ended with beginnings of multiculturalism, an emphasis on the poor, and liberal. The events of the world and the country called for a response in education. Space, segregation, civil rights, Vietnam, higher education, and in a word, freedom dominated the decade. The majority of political emphasis changed from an external or global focus such as the Cold War to considerations of internal affairs. Great leaders and orators stood behind podiums asking for a change in thinking. In President John F. Kennedy's 1961 inaugural speech, he said, "We stand today on the edge of a new frontier, the frontier of the 1960s, a frontier of unknown opportunities and perils, a frontier of unfulfilled hopes and threats. The new frontier of which I speak is not a set of promises, it is a set of challenges. And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." In Martin Luther King's 1963 March on Washington, his iconic speech captured the social, political, and educational change of the country. "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Implementation of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, the Supreme Court ruling of 1954 declaring that segregated education was inherently unequal did not occur in any significant way until the 1960s, but the changes did not come quickly or without extensive federal intervention. Most Southern school districts were practicing ingenious procrastination, but after a federal district court order threatened schools with sacrificing state financial aid, 14 Southern school districts agreed in late 1960 to desegregate first grade that year and to desegregate a grade year per year after that. Although some school districts complied with the court-ordered desegregation without incident, many did not. This defiance in both the North and the South prompted a 1969 unanimous Supreme Court decision declaring that it is the obligation of every school district to terminate dual school systems at once and to operate now and hereafter only unitary schools. The sense of crisis caused by desegregation was intensified by the severe shortages of qualified teachers to meet the technological challenges of modern society and the critical lack of classroom space to house ever-growing numbers of students entering schools and colleges. The U.S. Office of Education estimated that in 1960, 195,000 teachers were needed to wipe out deficits, replace substandard teachers, and to reduce class sizes to manageable numbers. But the average starting teacher salary was $5,160, and it did not compare with the average salary of most other careers, which was $10,700. Even though the number of college graduates was swelling, those graduates were not choosing teaching as their professions in order to fulfill the growing need within the schools. The gap between the learning need of the country and the capacity of the American educational system to meet those needs was at a crisis point at the beginning of the decade, and the resulting demands for more and better education forced reassessment of every segment of the teaching-learning process. Changes to the system were forced, sometimes by law, sometimes by riot, resulting in tumult and at times chaos. Public school education has historically been under state control and local control, but during the 1960s, the federal government played an ever-increasing role in the funding of American schools. In the early 1960s, even while most school boards tenaciously rejected a national education policy, they pleaded for federal funds to help alleviate dire shortages of teachers and to supplement their pay. Subsequent support of Kennedy by the National Education Association was a significant factor in his narrow victory over Nixon. During the Kennedy-Johnson era, an extraordinary transformation of federal education policy took place. At the end of the decade, massive amounts of federal aid had gone into all phases of education, from Head Start programs for deprived preschoolers to $9 billion in classroom, libraries, and labs. One of the cruelest ironies of the era is just as the federal government implemented programs and policies to level up the bottom fifth of school population, the quality of the standard curriculum at the center of Americans' public school system began to spiral downward. During the decade of great debate, sounded in the popular press and in the professional journals, should the essential purpose of education be intellectual training or social adjustment? The 1960s was the decade that we went to the moon. TVs became popular in American homes. Computers were mysterious machines that filled rooms. Teachers had new technology of the overhead projector. It was a decade of creation of some of the greatest music ever written, and often classified with the phrase of "make love, not war." It was a watermark era in the United States, and as Charles Dickens so eloquently stated, it was the best of times and it was the worst of times. This is the 1960s in American education.
We shall overcome one day.